welcome everyone. So happy to be together again, learning together again. This class is the Postmodern Piety of Rav Shagar with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. I'll be sending invitations to become a panelist so you can participate in class if you wish. Whenever you would like to verbally participate, just unmute yourself if you're a panelist. Otherwise, please keep yourself muted so we don't have background noise. You can also engage in class in writing here on the chat in the Zoom box or as a written comment on Facebook. I'll be monitoring Facebook Live. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you so much, Evie. Welcome back. Hope everybody had a Freilich and Purim. We are continuing in our learning on Rav Shagar, the postmodern piety of Rav Shagar. And the purpose of these classes has been to look at how Rav Shagar re-envisions what it means to be a religious Jew, a pious Jew, in the aftermath of his personal experiences, his personal traumas in the Yom Kippur War, his experience, or I should say the experience of his parents as Holocaust survivors, and as somebody who takes life very, very seriously. And for Rav Shagar, his religious faith, his religious outlook has to be one that doesn't deny life, but takes it fully into account. Rav Shagar wants faith without illusions. He wants us to be able to believe, not simply because we want it to be true, but because on some level we feel that it is true, that we can't escape it. We've looked at how Rav Shagar conceives of religiosity, being bound to God, being connected to God, God's Torah, how language shapes our world, how even when things are taken away from us, even when there's suffering, even when there's pain, even when there's a loss of meaning, that there is still something fundamentally that remains, if we can recognize that. And as Jews, I think we're sort of masters at recognizing that something always remains, even when it appears that things have been taken away. And what I wanted to look at tonight is, in a sense, where the rubber hits the road. Right? It's great to talk about theology, about God, about suffering, but these are all still, to a certain extent, in the abstract. Right? What happens when we have to sort of make our religious beliefs and commitments concrete and real and manifest in our own lives? And that takes us to the question of tefillah, of prayer. Right? And one of the things that I find so interesting about prayer is that you will often see these grand debates, like I said, about theological questions, philosophical questions. But at the end of the day, where all that comes to be a very real and pointed question for us is in the act of prayer, right? You can write books and articles and poetry about Amunah, about faith, but what do you do when it comes time to daven? And it's not such a simple question at all. And for me, I find, whether it's Rav Shagar or other thinkers who are grappling with the difficult questions, right? One of the big tests is how do they conceive of prayer? Do they still place an emphasis, a great significance on prayer? And I want to contend, and I think for Rav Shagar this is very much true, is that prayer is central to being a Jew, right? It's hard to imagine a Judaism without tefillah. Right, for a whole host of reasons. Number one is because we do it so often, right? Jews pray 3 times a day, and when we're not praying, we're offering brachot, or we're doing a million other things that are relatively close to the idea of prayer, right? If you strip that all away, if you take that all away from a Jew, again, what's left? So there's something about prayer, again, that is just so central. Yet at the same time, we know, and one of the things I appreciate about the Jewish tradition is that the Torah, the rabbis, the tradition recognizes just how profoundly hard prayer is. Like, prayer is just something that seems really, really hard to do, at least in the way that a Jew aspires to do it. And there are countless reasons why prayer is hard. And some of them are more contemporary, but a lot of them are not original to us, right? These are problems in which Jews have been struggling with since basically forever, right? With the many challenges of prayer. Though it certainly seems in today's day and world, right, we feel additional challenges to prayer that perhaps our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents never really had to encounter before. But again, if you want to deal with deep theological questions, that's great. But again, prayer is where it becomes real. Prayer is where you can't just say nice words, but they actually have to mean something on some level. The act has to actually mean something on some level to you. So I know I've spent a lot of these classes sort of, speaking frontally. I want to start this one though, just by opening it up to participants. And I want to ask you, why is prayer so hard? Right? Again, something that if you're a Jew, you probably try to do maybe every day, maybe just once in a while, but however frequent or infrequently you do it, you probably encounter some difficulties with it. So I want to throw it open. Why is prayer hard? And either in little ways or in very, very big ways. Do we have any brave volunteers? Sherry, I see you with your hand raised. So what makes prayer hard?
We're using words that are 2,000 years old. No, it's not contemporary. It's strange concepts very often.
Good. Right. So there's something about the language of prayer that we find deeply alien to our own experience. And if we were to compose our own prayers, which some of you may have done before, right? We don't typically, we might use a little bit of the language, but again, so much of the straightforward language of prayer just feels deeply foreign to us, especially the heavily gendered language of prayer, right? God is a gendered figure, right? If these are things that you find upsetting, right, then turning to prayer is going to be a very, alienating experience. So the language of it, the way it is alien and foreign to our sensibility, which just means, how can we say it from the heart, right? That's the whole idea. Prayer is supposed to be from the heart. How can it be from the heart if the words I'm using are words I would never use if it was up to me? Good. So what else makes prayer challenging? Judith?
I'm going to make it an even bigger issue. Many shuls have in front of where you're davening, Da lifnei mi ata omed, and the very concept of what we consider God to be is so amorphous that it is a major issue to grapple with when you're trying to confront this being that you don't know or can't describe.
So you're absolutely right. And this is something, I'm glad you're raising this, because it's something that we as Jews often miss because we don't realize how unique it is to our own experience. Other religions, for the most part of what makes prayer easier for them is that they have an image of what they can pray to, right? This is pretty defining for Christianity, certainly Catholicism, but even for Protestantism as well, right? There's an image, right? You want to know what you're praying to, who you're praying to. We can give you a picture and you can point at it and you can have some sense of how you're supposed to focus your intentions. And we don't have that. And we don't realize how hard it is to pray without having an image or a clear sense of what exactly that you are praying to. To point this out, I'm going to give you a radical teaching here. So the Piety Rabbi, who's a Rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II, he actually has a teaching in one of his books where he's approached by a young man. And the young man basically says, I really struggle with prayer because I don't know who or what I'm praying to. And the Rebbe says as follows, and this was radical. He says, you know what? If you want, when you pray, you can have an image in mind as to what you are praying to. Like you can imagine if you want to, like an old man with a beard on a throne, right? It's radical because as Jews, we don't think you're supposed to say this, right? Like you're never supposed to be praying to anything. The Piety Rebbe says, like, this isn't a good thing, but if you feel it's the only way that you can pray, then it can be a temporary measure to get you to a place where prayer feels more natural, and then you should move beyond it, right? So nobody else that I'm aware of in the Jewish tradition says this, and I very much agree with a lot of what the Piety Rebbe says in general. And in this case, too, he's being sensitive to a profoundly difficult problem, is that when a Jew gets up to pray, they open up a prayer book, there's some words in it, but who or what are we praying to? And that in itself can be, essentially the ultimate barrier to prayer. What else makes prayer difficult for us? And I say this, I want to be clear, as somebody who struggles with prayer. I don't find prayer easy, and I'll give you my list of reasons, but I want to make sure other people have a chance to share first. Daniel, you had hands?
Yeah. I guess to me, it's the timing of it. It's easy to pray when you're in great need or something like that. But here, when it's at a assigned time and you're in between the 100 other things you're doing in your day, that's challenging to me. To sort of, what are you supposed to think about when you're thinking you've got a million other things on your mind?
Right.
Yeah.
No, prayer never seems to come at the right time, right? Like that's one of the, the major lessons of religious life, right? When the moments come, when you really feel you can pray, it's not usually in shul. And when you're in shul, even if you're on your way to shul, right, you feel like this is something you want. Somehow the moment you get there, the moment you see door, like you feel like it's, you've lost it, right? So the fact that the stars don't always align to allow for it, and especially in today's world where we're so busy, so distracted, right? It becomes just a really profoundly difficult thing. Right? Sometimes I'll note, I actually relate to the fact that prayer comes when I don't want it, but that usually is only like mincha. Right, mincha is always the prayer of the three prayers in the day that comes when the least easy time. Because shachar you do when you first wake up, Marv you basically do before you go to bed. But what about mincha? Right, like to daven mincha, like you have to remember it. But there's something special about sometimes mincha comes, you don't realize it, you just got to daven. But mincha is a short prayer. That's why it kind of works that way for me, even when it catches me off guard. Shacharit or like longer prayers in the Chagim, or even sitting there listening to the Megillah. Right, it's long. Right, and if sometimes you're up for it for some of it. But sometimes you reach a point and you're like, why am I still here listening to this? Why am I still here saying these words, right? It never seems to work the whole time in the way exactly that we might want. Any other reasons what makes prayer so hard?
The rote quality. It's the same words over and over. And even when you have an occasional time when the words actually are quite meaningful and you connect to them, then you go back and you start over again. And that is so and many different ways to unroad it, but it's the words and the repetition that I find very difficult.
Yeah, look, I find the repetition to be a double-edged sword. Sometimes the fact you keep coming back to the same words, it gives them additional meaning that you never would have seen in them originally. But there are many times in which you're saying to yourself, the fact I'm saying the same words again is exactly what empties them of their meaning, right? So it's like sometimes it's helpful, and a lot of times it's not, and that repetition is not such an easy thing for us. Sometimes it's not even the same tefillot every day. Sometimes it's like, I'm just back to Shabbos again, saying the same prayer again. Even with things that come a little less frequently, the fact that they're still constantly repetitive, I've done this before, I've done this 100 times, can sometimes get in the way of trying to have a sense of what is going on here. Any other
I think
comments?
Naomi was raising her hand earlier.
Oh, please,
and then
Naomi.
she did.
Kavanah is an ongoing issue for me, having extraneous thoughts come in, and I invariably apologize to Hashem after my davening that my kavanah was not better. So that's an issue.
So kavanah is something that is really, really hard. And one of the, I guess, good things you could say about the Jewish tradition is that the rabbis are very open about how they struggle with kavanah, right? There's a famous Talmud Yerushalmi in which the rabbis basically, so different rabbis say, they basically admit to never having kavanah. They say, I thank my head when we get to the modim section of the Amidah because it remembers to bow. I don't remember to bow, but my head remembers to bow, right? Or there's another rabbi who says, when I'm davening Shemona Esrei, I'm counting the tiles on the ceiling. So at least when you read things like that, it makes us aware, again, just how challenging the act is and how frequently it isn't what we want it to be. Right? Unfortunately, rabbis don't talk enough about the fact that prayer is rarely what we want it to be. Even if we think we should be doing it, it's still rarely what we want it to be, and that's okay. Like I want to just name that as being okay, right? The fact that we keep coming back to it is what is significant, not the question of whether each and every time it means everything that we want it to be. So let me use Naomi's point for jumping off for the first text that I want us to look at, because what we're going to look at with Rav Shagar tonight, I could have brought you, we could look at sort of different ways Rav Shagar conceptualizes prayer. But what I want to do is instead get it a little bit harder. And that is to look at how Rav Shagar recognizes that prayer is kind of impossible. Because I think it's only if we recognize the way in which prayer is kind of impossible that we can unpack all of these other issues that everybody acknowledged and try to get at, like, what is it that we're doing when we pray, knowing it seems so hard and so difficult for us. And I'll also point out what nobody mentioned, though I think Judy kind of touched on it, is that living as modern people as we do, like every challenge that was raised is one that could have been raised by your great-great-grandparents. But we, a century later, have the additional challenge of modernity and having lived through events that put the act of prayer into a very different perspective for us, which also goes to the way in which prayer is a bit impossible. And I'll just note this because we'll see in a moment, right? What does prayer mean after the Holocaust, right? That is a profound question that we're going to have to think through in addition to all of the other challenges that people are ultimately raising. But to the question of kavanah, which Naomi raised. What we're going to do to kind of help put this in perspective is we're going to look at some teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, because Rabbi Nachman, as we've seen, is a major focus for Rav Shagar. And part of what Rav Shagar appreciates so much about Rabbi Nachman is Rabbi Nachman's ability to make a space in religious language for those things that the rabbis want to repress and push away and deny. Right? We saw this before with the idea of the void. Rabbi Nachman talks about the void, the place that is absent of God, the place in which there are questions without answers, and how that space can still be brought into religious language, even if there are no answers to the questions that the void presents us with. And that's just an example of how Rabbi Nachman makes a space for those things that religious language normally cannot make a space for. And it shouldn't surprise us, therefore, that Rabbi Nachman notes how difficult prayer really is. And one of the things that he focuses on is this idea of machshavot zarot, right? These thoughts that pop in our head when we're trying to daven that basically get in the way of having any kavanah. This is a major theme in Chassidut. And what's fascinating is Rabbi Nachman, Naomi, doesn't only say that you're going to have, foreign thoughts pop into your head. He actually wants to argue that maybe this is a good thing, right? Why is this a good thing? Well, here's what he says. He says, or let me put it this way. If we're willing to acknowledge the extent that we have foreign thoughts pop in our head, this might be a good thing. Not everybody is often so aware that it's happening. But here's what he says. He says, this is Rabbi Nachman, and Rav Shagar cites this in one of his writings. He said, Rabbi Nachman says, you may be influenced by false motives and distracted by many outside thoughts when you pray. Right? That's true. I mean, that happens to me. I'm sure it happens to all of us. Ignore them completely. Do not do your part and say all the prayers in order, ignoring all disturbing thoughts. Do what you must and disregard those thoughts completely. So the initial approach sort of sounds like if you have these things, just ignore them, repress them, move on. But that's not what Rabbi Nachman says. What Rabbi Nachman says, he continues here. He says, the Rebbe also said that these disturbing thoughts actually benefit our prayers. Right? They're actually good. Why? Without distracting thoughts, prayer would be impossible. Tremendous powers are always at work attempting to denounce proper prayers, but distracting thoughts serve to disguise our prayers so that they are ignored by the outside forces, by Sitra Achra, right? So the demonic forces of the divine. Then these forces do not denounce the prayers and they are allowed to enter on high. So we have to understand, Rabbi Nachman is being Rabbi Nachman often does, is a bit ironic here. But what he's saying is as follows. When you have all these foreign thoughts pop into your prayer, when you sit down to pray and you're like, I don't know what these words mean. Why am I saying them? I don't know who I'm praying to. Is anybody even listening to this? Right? Those thoughts, I don't want to be here right now. Right? These thoughts are actually good because what they do is they disguise your prayer. Because if your prayer didn't have all these foreign thoughts, the demons would take the prayer. It's the fact that your prayer has all these foreign thoughts that's actually what lets them get to God. Right? Which just sounds crazy to us, right? It's a total reversal here. But what Rabbi Nachman is pointing out in a very straightforward way is that basically all prayer has these machshavot zarot, right? That's why he's saying it's actually a good thing, right? You only have to say this if you can recognize that prayer almost always has this. And I speak to Naomi because I've known Naomi a long time, but right, this is something that we shouldn't take too seriously, that we don't have to feel bad when prayer isn't what we want it to be. Because again, as Rabbi Nachman here says, right, like maybe that's like what prayer is at the end of the day. Maybe that's what makes prayer real, is that you're aware of how it's not the prayer that you ultimately want it to be, which is radical, but Rabbi Nachman is nevertheless, trying to tell us to take that into consideration. So I wanted to use this first text by Rabbi Nachman as a way of introduction to get at, because again, he's one of the few rabbis who notes this, that prayer is basically never what we want it to be. And what I want to do now is to look at a story of Rabbi Nachman that gets at this in an even more radical way. That prayer is, in a sense, impossible. Rabbi Nachman told many, many stories, very, very interesting, compelling stories, Kafkaesque stories, and he would often use the stories to convey sophisticated religious ideals, and he also often used them to offer critique. Right? People are willing to listen to critique in a story that they're not willing to listen to in a direct manner. Right? That's one thing I learned as a shul rabbi. If you want to critique people, make sure that you tell them in a way that they can hear it where they don't have to feel it's applying to them. Right? I'm not the first person to note this. Right? When Natan the prophet has to rebuke David HaMelech, right? He has to do it through a parable, through a story, because he knows David won't hear it directly. And Rabbi Nachman understands this as well, that we need stories to encounter difficult truths. So I'm going to read you the story. I didn't put it up on the screen here, but let me go. I'll tell it over to you, and then we'll see how it gets at this idea of how prayer really, when push comes to shove, is so challenging and maybe even impossible. So this is a story in Hebrew known as Ma'aseh Bitachon. It's a story about having trust in God, but like a lot of Rabbi Nachman stories, it kind of seems like the opposite of that on a certain level. So here's the story. The story begins with a king, like a lot of stories. A king who wants to travel his kingdom in order to explore his land. And he leaves the palace. And what he's looking to see as he leaves the palace, travels through the land, is to find if anybody has it better than him. Right? He's the king. He's supposed to be living the best life. Right? But he wants to see if any of his people maybe have it even better than he does. So he leaves the palace. He's traveling the land. And eventually he encounters a man who lives in a rundown house. This man has very little, right? The house is somewhat in disrepair, right? There's very little furnishings inside. But when the king approaches the house, he sees the man at his table. The man has some food and drink, and the man seems very, very happy. And that's what initially strikes the king. You see this guy who doesn't have very much, but he seems very, very happy. So the king says to himself, you know what? If this guy thinks he's so happy, I'm going to see what I can do about that. And the king decides that he wants to make this man's life very, very difficult. Now, it's not clear exactly what is motivating the king. Is he jealous of the man? Is he, just trying to use his power capriciously? It's not clear, but he gets it in his head, the king at least, that he's going to make this man's life difficult. He's going to make sure that he's not so happy. So the king discovers that this man is actually a repairman, and he makes his living by taking broken objects and fixing them. And this man has a great gift in repairing objects. He can basically take anything that's broken and make it better. And because he's such a good repairman, that's how he earns his money, so that he can buy food and drink and be happy each day. So what does the king do to try to ruin the man's life? Well, he makes a decree throughout the kingdom that nothing can be fixed if it's broken, right? If something you have of value is broken, you can't get it fixed. You can't go to the repairman and get it repaired. So this obviously presents a problem to the man, because this is the way that he makes a living. So what's he going to do? He can't fix things. How is he going to get money? How is he going to have his food and drink? How is he going to live his happy life? So what does the repairman do? Well, he leaves his house a bit forlorn, and he happens to run into a rich man. And the rich man says that he needs somebody to cut wood for him. So the repairman, the poor man, says to himself, this is my opportunity. I can't make money repairing objects, but I can cut wood. And so he says, I'll cut the wood for you if you can pay me. And so that's what he does. He cuts the wood. The rich man pays him. He has enough money so he can buy food and drink, and he goes home and he's happy. Well, the king comes to visit the poor man because he wants to see whether or not his decree has worked the way that he wanted, to see if the poor man is no longer happy because he can't repair things, he can't make money. But when he shows up at the man's home, he sees that he has food and drink there, and he's surprised. And he asked him, well, how is it that you were able to get your food and your drink? And the poor man says, well, I couldn't repair things, but I was able to chop wood for somebody and make money that way. So the king thinks to himself, okay, it didn't work the first time when I banned repairing things, but I'll get him this time. And so the king now issues a second declaration. And keep in mind, the poor man doesn't know this is the king. He doesn't know this guy's here doing all this. But the king says, I'm going to make it illegal to chop wood. And this is how I'm going to get him. So, of course, he issues the decree. And then when the poor man finds out, he's obviously not happy about this. He's like, well, wait a second. I was repairing things. I could make money that way. Now I can't. I was chopping wood. What am I going to do now? So he leaves his home. Again, he's all upset. And he comes across a man who's cleaning stables, right? Not easy work, not fun work to clean dirty, disgusting stables. But he sees somebody doing it, and the poor man says, well, you know what? I'll clean those stables if you pay me. And the guy says, sure, I'll do that. And so once again, the poor man is able to make money. He works for the day, hard, dirty, difficult work, but he makes enough money to buy food, to buy drink, to go home and to be happy. Once again, the king comes, and the king sees this man is happy, and he's all upset. What's going on here? I stopped him from being able to chop wood. And when the poor man tells him that he was able to clean stables for money, the king's like, okay, now I got him. No more cleaning stables. And he issues a decree throughout the kingdom saying you cannot clean stables for money. And once again, he's like, I got him. But the poor man leaves home. He's upset. He's not sure what to do. How is he going to make money? He's trying everything he can every day. He's making it work, but barely. And he says, you know what? I'll go be a soldier. I'll go enlist in the army, because at least then I'll get a regular salary. So he goes to the head officer, enlists in the army, and he basically says, I'll become a soldier as long as you pay me every day. So I'll have enough money to get my food and drink and be happy. Right? And he seemingly thinks this works. Once again, the king shows up at his house. He sees him happy. He sees him with money. He says, what's going on here? He tells the king, I'm a soldier now. I've enlisted in the army. I get paid every day. So the king says, okay, I'm going to keep trying here. And what the king does is he goes back and he issues a decree that the soldiers are not allowed to receive their salary at the end of each day. Right? They're only going to get it after some period of time. So once again, the man is stuck. He needs the money at the end of the day to buy food and drink to be happy. But he can't do that. So he goes to the head officer and he basically begs him, can you please just pay me at the end of the day? I need the money to get food and drink. And the head army officer says, sorry, I can't do that. You can get it tomorrow, but not today, because that's the king's decree. So the man is obviously upset. What's he going to do? But he's creative, right? This is a guy who finds his way through anything. So he says, here's what I'll do. I'll pawn the blade of my sword. He gets a sword for being a soldier. He'll take out the blade, he'll pawn it, and he'll use the money to buy food and drink. And he'll know that he'll get paid in a couple of days. And when he gets paid, he'll use that money to buy back the blade for the sword. And nobody will know otherwise. And in the meantime, he'll replace the metal blade with a wooden blade. So it'll still look like he's got a sword, even though it's really just a wooden sword and it's basically not effective at all. But he'll have his money. When he gets paid in 2 days, it'll all work out. Goes home, he's got his money, he's happy. He thinks he's got it figured out. The king shows up again. The king's like, what's going on here? This is like every attempt, right? This guy keeps thwarting him. And he finds out that the guy's pawned his sword blade. He's got money. And the king's like, okay, I've trapped him. I've got one final solution. This is going to resolve everything. I'm finally going to trap this guy so that he's going to be unhappy. He's got no way out. So what he does, he tells the head officer to come to the man and tell him, the king has got a criminal who needs to be executed. And you, the soldier, have to come before the king and execute the criminal. And when the man hears this, he's upset. He's upset, first of all, because he doesn't want to kill anybody. But second of all, because he doesn't have a sword that can actually kill somebody even if he wanted to. He's only got a wooden sword. And if he shows up at the king with a wooden sword, everybody's going to know that he pawned the blade, and it's going to be a real problem for him. So the man's not sure what to do. He's thought his way out of everything, but he's not sure what to do. So he does finally go to the king. He's in this impossible situation. He goes to the king. He begs to not make him kill the criminal. He even says to the king, please, can't you find somebody else to do this? King says, no, it's got to be you. All right, so the man is basically stuck. He doesn't know what to do. Finally, he looks up to the heaven and he offers a prayer. What's his prayer? He says, God Almighty, I never killed a person in my life. If this man does not deserve to die, let the blade of my sword turn into wood. And with that, the man draws out his sword. And of course, it's the wooden sword. And everybody sees that the blade was a piece of wood. And all those present, including the king, had a good laugh. They saw what a fine man that this person was, and they let him go in peace. Right? So the whole climax of the story is the man who keeps trying to find his way out of all these sorrows, all these difficulties. He finally gets trapped, right? He finally gets trapped because he's in an impossible situation. But he's asked to pull out the sword and kill somebody, which he doesn't want to do and couldn't even do even if he wanted to. And all the more so, what he doesn't know is the king knows that the wooden sword is just wood, right? That it's not a real sword. But nonetheless, the guy comes up with one final idea, right? Before he pulls out the sword, he offers a prayer, basically saying, again, it's almost like a joke. He knows the sword isn't real, but he's going to tell everybody, if the sword isn't real, then this guy must really be innocent, right? And he pulls out the wooden sword. Of course, what he doesn't realize is the king knows the sword is wooden. This isn't a miracle. It's not like something magically happened and proved to everybody the guy is innocent. The king knows this, but nonetheless, the king is so entertained by this man and his creativity, you might say, that he's going to do this no matter what, that he's willing to let him go free. So what is going on here with this story? The way Rav Shagar understands it, and I'll read it in just a moment, is that we have to look at this story as the fundamental difficulty of being a religious person in the world, right? We have a certain religious narrative and a certain religious outlook that we take with us about the way the world is, the way we're supposed to be in the world, but then we keep running into challenges that don't enable us to make sense of that narrative, right? Each one of these bad things that happen to this guy, right, that the king keeps imposing on him, are essentially the challenges that we all experience to the religious narrative that we hold so dear for us. And what this guy keeps doing is each time he experiences a challenge to his faith, keeps finding a way to persevere, keeps finding a way to take that which is broken and somehow keep working with it, right? Part of the man's gift is that he recognizes that things are broken. If you think things can only be whole and perfect, then you can't live in a world where things break. Part of what this man's gift is that he recognizes that pretty much everything's broken. So when he runs into a challenge, that's okay, because nothing is ever perfect, right? He finds the flexibility, the creativity to keep seeing alternatives that other people don't see, right? That's part of his gift. But eventually, he keeps running into challenge after challenge after challenge. And no matter what creative opportunities or alternatives he can come up with, eventually he reaches a point in which he doesn't have the answer. Eventually he reaches a point where his narrative, basically he can't come up with a way out, right? A way to make sense of it. He finds himself in a situation where he has to pull the sword out, and he knows that sword isn't a real sword. And the last thing any of us want to do is humiliate ourselves and basically show to the world how that which we're pretending to be true really isn't true at all. So let me read you how Rav Shagar describes this whole moment and why it gets at the impossibility of prayer. He says, moreover, if we return to the final scene of Rabbi Nachman's story, it seems that a very radical religious insight is hidden in it. The prayer, which in various midrashim is represented by the sword and is the symbol of the religious world in general, is answered because it becomes a joke. So Rav Shagar is pointing out here is the sword is a metaphor for tefillah, for prayer, right? Because tefillah is supposed to be like our way of asserting our strength in the world, our weapon in the world, right? When things are tough, we pull out tefillah, we pray, and everything works out the way we want it to, right? You can understand the metaphor here. Like you're a soldier, you're facing adversity, there's an enemy, there's an obstacle, you pull out your sword and you are able to defeat them. But in the context of the story, right, tefillah is not a sword, not a metal sword that enables you to hack away at your enemies and defeat things, right? Tefillah is a wooden sword. It's a play sword. It's fake. And I'm going to be clear, it's not real. It's like a joke if you think it actually works. Right. And here's what Rav Shagar says, again, building on this. He says, in other words, the religious person discovers his disgrace, the fact of his lacking religious self, but he turns this disgrace itself into a joke. Right. If we want prayer to work, to be real, we struggle profoundly with the fact that it seems impossible 99.99999% of the time, for all the reasons that people gave, and even more so because we live in a world in which we have encountered so many profound obstacles to our faith that the very idea that we're going to pray and believe in the power of prayer is like believing that a wooden sword could be used to defend yourself against like an enemy or a knight or something like that. It's not going to work. That's not the way it works at the end of the day. And to pretend that your wooden sword is a real sword is to look like a fool, right? And that's exactly what the man does in the context of the story. He says, in this sense, the religious person is never what he really is, because he discovers that there is actually no such thing really. The sword he's waving is fictional. It's made of wood. So again, this is the way Rav Shagar is trying to play out the fact that prayer, in a sense, is impossible. Now, again, I don't want to minimize that we've all probably had meaningful experiences of prayer, right? Experiences where we felt God was present, experiences where we felt like we were speaking to something, someone. But we also have to be honest with ourselves that there's a lot of times in which we show up to want to pray and find it to be impossible. And the very idea that prayer is something that we can use as a weapon to protect ourselves or attack our enemies, or that we're going to defeat all the obstacles because of it, well, that just kind of looks absurd if you've lived enough time in this world. And I really want to, again, to sort of play out this sort of modern problem here that Rav Shagar is getting at, particularly post the Holocaust. The very idea that prayer is a meaningful act to us is very challenging, right? You can make the argument, and some people kind of do, that the act of a Jew getting up to pray after the Holocaust is like, again, pulling out your wooden sword and pretending it's a real sword. So I want to give you some examples of this and people who critique it in a sense. And then I want to turn to, well, wait a second, we still pray, right? We still pull out our wooden sword. And what exactly does that mean? So the first text I want us to look at in sort of capturing this is by Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, famous American Jewish theologian who wrote a lot about how we should think about the Holocaust. And Rav Yitz is very, very critical about what the Jewish theological response to be. He really feels that we can have no response to the Holocaust, that the Holocaust is the moment in which all of Judaism becomes kind of like a wooden sword, in a sense. And one of his famous lines that captures this is, he says as follows. He says, let us offer then as a working principle the following. No statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. And what Rav Yitz is getting at here is that if you want to talk theology, if you want to talk prayer, you better be prepared to do it in front of the gas chambers, right? And if you want to pray, or if you want to talk about God in front of the gas chambers, that is basically pure arrogance or purely incoherent, right? The very idea that one could talk about God or theology or why things happened or how we should, what's the theological understanding or response, right? To do that in front of burning children is basically something horrific and awful. And Rav Yitz is not wrong about this, right? If you're going to stand there in front of the gas chambers and try to offer theological explanations for things, there's something barbaric about that and horrific about that. And we should all be very suspect of anybody that is going to attempt to do that. In fact, and I brought this here, even though it's not exactly related, but Theodor Adorno, great theorist of the Frankfurt School, German Jew, ostensibly a Jew. He has a famous line after Auschwitz, you probably heard before, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And that basically gets at a similar idea that Rav Yitz is getting at, is there's something about the horrors of the Holocaust that sort of bring an end, not just to religious meaning, but to meaning writ large, right? There's something about poetry which loses its meaning in the face of the Holocaust, which devours all meaning in its extremity, in its pure, traumatic, overwhelming, abyss. And both Rav Yitz and Adorno are getting at this idea. There's something, in a sense, about trying to live a life of meaning or religiosity after that which we cannot understand, that just looks absurd. Now, as I said before, Rav Yitz says, no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. That's Rav Yitz's point. Now, the problem that Yitz never really acknowledges is that we might say that theological statements don't have meaning in the presence of burning children, but people still offer theological statements in the presence of burning children. And I'm not talking about the rabbis who try to explain it or justify it. I'm talking about the Jews who prayed, right? The Jews who prayed at Auschwitz, or the survivors that prayed immediately after Auschwitz. And we should not look lightly on what they're doing, because those who prayed in Auschwitz or right after Auschwitz, they know their prayers are to a certain extent absurd. They know to a certain extent their prayers are like pulling out the wooden sword. And we have to ask ourselves then, why are they still doing it? They're not doing it because they're cruelly trying to repress or deny what happened, right? They're pulling the sword out of the sheath because that's what Jews do when it comes to prayer. Even when it makes us look crazy, we still pull the sword out. So I want to give an example of this because I personally find it very, very powerful and compelling. And that is by Rav Yehuda Amital, who we spoke about in one of the earlier lectures, who was himself a Holocaust survivor. And in his later life, Rav Amital was much more open to sort of rethinking difficult religious questions. Earlier, when we saw him, he was very much messianic and sort of trying to push away all the challenges of the Yom Kippur War. But he writes this piece towards the end of his life when he's reflecting on his experiences as a Holocaust survivor. And he's acknowledging how impossible religiosity is in the face of the Holocaust. And here's what he says. He doesn't describe praying in the camps, but he talks about praying literally right afterwards. He says, on my first Yom Kippur after being liberated from a Nazi labor camp, I prayed with other survivors in a cramped cellar. I cannot fully describe the storm of emotion that I felt then, but I would try to reconstruct some of that feeling. Like you can imagine the moment here, they've just been liberated. So on the one hand, there's some sense of positivity, but they've all been through hell. And they're cramped in a cellar, who knows where, and he was in Hungary or whatever, who knows where, cramped in a cellar, not really sure what they're doing there, not really even sure what they're praying for. He says, I was young then, I had no children. My parents had been murdered along with most of the population of our town. Among the survivors in that room, there were people who had lost their children, parents, spouses, and siblings. Meaning there are people in that room, he's trying to sort of distance himself a little bit. He'd lost a lot. There were people there who'd lost everything. There were people there whose losses were fundamentally unimaginable. And they're all looking at each other, right? They're all basically looking at each other saying, what the heck are we doing here? But like, this is where we are. Like, what can these prayers possibly mean? Yet Rav Amital says they prayed and I was with them. And he notes there's something, again, absurd about this prayer. He says, was there worship of God based on gratitude, which is fundamental to how we think about prayer? The prayer is about being grateful to God, thanking God. Can a Jew who's lost his wife and children possibly serve God on the basis of recognition of his kindness? Right? Can a Jew whose job was the removal of the charred remains of corpses from the crematorium of Auschwitz be capable of serving God on the basis of gratitude? No, not in any way, shape, or form. But where then does that leave us? Right? What he's acknowledging here is that Jews in Auschwitz and afterwards, they pulled that wooden sword out, as absurd and as crazy as it was, and they prayed. And we have to ask ourselves is, if prayer is impossible, right? If it doesn't make sense, if it's absurd and it's most extreme, I'm not saying we always feel this, but at its extreme, we've certainly had moments where we probably all feel this, then like, what are we even doing? And that is the dilemma that Rav Shagar identifies. But the truth is that a Jew still pulls out their sword, right? Even when it seems impossible, even when it stops making sense. So I want to try to understand a little bit more with Rav Shagar. How is it that we can pull that sword out in a way that is kind of absurd and ridiculous, but we keep doing it anyway, nonetheless? So to explain that, I want to first start by looking at an idea that we saw a couple of weeks ago, and it's connected to Purim, so it's appropriate. And that is the idea that there's a certain sense in which our Jewishness is not something we can ever fully escape, right? And even when it stops making sense to us, there's a way in which, like, our Jewishness is still with us, whether we like it or not. And the example that Rav Shagar uses to describe this is based on the famous Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, that when God gives the Torah to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai, God lifts the mountain over their heads and threatens them, accept the Torah, or I'm going to crush you underneath the mountain. The Jewish people do what any reasonable people would do. We say, okay, God, we'll take it. We don't want to die here. But of course, the Gemara notes that the Jewish response to this could then legitimately be that we shouldn't be punished when we don't live up to the Torah because it wasn't something we accepted. It was something you, God, forced upon us. And the Gemara famously answers, well, the Jewish people didn't willfully accept the Torah at Har Sinai, but they did accept it during the time of Purim, during the time of God's absence. Because as I think I've mentioned before, we often don't recognize what things mean to us until they are no longer there. We don't often recognize the way in which we are connected to things until they are no longer there. And what Rav Shagar notes here, and this is an idea based on the Maharal, that God had to force the Torah on us so that we would come to later recognize the way in which we can't ever really escape the Torah. And that when we say that the Jewish people freely accepted the Torah during Purim, what it really means is not that they suddenly choose it amongst like 5 other options. What it means is they finally freely recognized the way in which they can't escape it, right? Like I'm going to use my parental example for a moment. There are certain things that my parents like forced me to do. And at the time I was like, I don't want to do this. This is stupid. This is crazy. Why are you doing this? But as long as you live in their house, you're compelled to do certain things. And you probably even tell yourself, you know, like when you're a kid, you know, at the moment I get out of this house, I'm never going to do it that way again, because I just think this is crazy. Then finally you grow up, you leave home, and you have the opportunity to do it your way. And then you realize, well, wait a second, like, why is it that part of me wants to do what my parents still want to do? Like, I have a choice now. I could do other things. I never really wanted to do that in the first place. But you sometimes discover that those things that your parents forced upon you are things that you cannot so easily escape. And sometimes it's only when they're no longer around do you realize, wow, like this is part of me, whether I like it or not, right? This is the way Rav Shagar explains it. He says, God compelled Israel to accept the Torah because only through such compulsion could their acceptance take on an essential necessity not given to any renunciation. The compulsion spoken of here needs to be understood not as mere external duress, but rather in the psychological sense of inner necessity. The Jew is bound to his Jewishness in a compulsive fashion and cannot escape it. Right? Sometimes it's only the things that have been forced on us, the things that we didn't have a choice about, right? The things that we were born into, whether we like it or not, that become essential for us, that we feel compelled by, even when we realize that we don't actually have to live by them or accept them anymore whatsoever. And part of what a Jew realizes is that when you take everything away, when you put us in the most absurdist situation imaginable, we're still going to pray. Because that's just what Jews do, even though we know that it looks a bit crazy, right? There are things, that compulsions that we've learned or taken in from our parents that we know are ridiculous. But like, what are we going to do? This is the way we were raised. This is who we are. Like at a certain point, being an adult, and this just means learning how to accept that. Now, this idea, as it comes to prayer, I think is a very powerful one. because when prayer stops making sense to us, when it seems impossible, we do it anyway. And what does it mean to do something that seems impossible when we can't necessarily stop ourselves from doing it anyway? And this gets into this idea of prayer almost as a symptom, right? Like a symptom in a psychoanalytic sense, that there are things about ourselves that we never fully understand, and we keep finding ourselves maybe repetitively, even obsessively drawn to in ways that are unconscious, but still compel us nonetheless. And one of Rav Shagar's students, Yishai Mevorach, really plays up, I think, this idea nicely with tefillah, that there's something about tefillah that we do because that's just like what we do, even if it looks crazy to others, let alone to us. Like, we just do this. That's what a Jew does. Jew goes to shul, right? Jew goes to pray. Jew opens a siddur, right? Like, even if the words are ridiculous to us, again, maybe we don't do it all the time. Maybe we don't want to do it, but there are moments where we find ourselves bound to it in ways that we can't fully escape. And nothing proves that more than the Jews who prayed in Auschwitz or just afterwards, as Rav Mital described. So Rav Shagar's student Yishai plays up this idea through a verse in Tehillim of the Ani Tefillah, which means, I would say metaphorically, that I am prayer. Without getting into the literal meaning, though I brought that here, it literally means I must stand in judgment. But here, in the context of drashot, it means I am prayer. We become a prayer. Our bodies express prayer, whether we are fully conscious of it or not. Right? There's something about prayer that is deeply embedded inside of us that finds its way out, even if we don't really understand it, and even if it doesn't even recognizably look like prayer as it's traditionally understood. So I want to give you just some examples of how Yishai describes this, of the way, again, we keep pulling that wooden sword out, whether we like it or not. He says, I stand in prayer. I accept myself, the fact that prayer is placed as a part of the horizon of my life. Prayer is just part of what I am as a Jew. It's just one of those things I do. It is not faith in prayer that is found in that it helps and that it heals the sick, but prayer as an act, as much as I do. It occurs in my life as an expression of lips, as kneeling and experiencing, as lifting eyes and hands to the sky, as an appeal to the Lord of the world, as a supplication to God. Meaning prayer isn't just the words that we say. It's not really even the intentions behind the words. Prayer is like an act. It's like something we do physically. It's something we do physically in the sense that we're not even always aware fully while we're doing it. I gave the example before, the rabbi who says he thanks his head when he bows during Shemona Esrei when he gets to Modim because he wasn't going to remember, so his head remembers. So you can look at that as absurd, like, oh, that poor rabbi doesn't know how to pray with any real kavanah. Well, Yishai is saying that maybe the very fact that your body just knows to do that gets at something deeper, which prayer is all about. Prayer is like, it's like written in your heart. It's written on your goof, on your body in a certain sense, that you just do it. You feel compelled to do it. You keep coming back to it. Yishai says, when I say I prayed for so-and-so's healing, I'm not saying that I prayed because I believe in so-and-so's healing, nor because I prayed because I believe that my prayer will heal them. But I say that I prayed for so-and-so's healing. That is what I did. I did not make a claim, but reported an act. Right? The very act of prayer is more an act than anything else. He's saying here, when I pray for somebody, I can't say what I'm praying, who I'm praying to, or that it's going to work, or that I understand it. I'm doing it because that's what a Jew does. A Jew prays. I say the words, even if it doesn't always make sense, even if I don't always even understand fully the meaning behind that act. He says here again, people pray. That is partly what they do in a mincha prayer, at a street corner before it gets dark, and running for the bus that will not arrive in time, in the swaying of the body and closing one's eyes, in reciting psalms and saying, by God's help, Bezrat Hashem, in the desperate sigh of, oh God. We just do this. This is what it means to be a Jew. You say these things, your body does these things, right? We are prayerful people, whether we like it or not. And then he goes on, he says, prayer is part of the body and not part of the soul or spirit. This is the meaning of the expression, I am prayer. In different Hasidic drashot, the act of tefillah is inscribed on the subject, on the person. Prayer is the excess of one's being. So teaches Rav Tzadok. If so, the source of prayer is not part of a person. It is impossible to pray unless God opens his lips in prayer. This is what Tzadok says. Meaning, if we're going to pray, it's not really up to us. If we're going to pray, it's kind of a miracle in a certain sense. Or that pray with kavanah is kind of a miracle. Therefore, it is foreign to a person, but is still inscribed on his eye, because a person is the dwelling place of God's glory. This means that the foreign divine disturbance, prayer, is part of the body. And what all these texts get at is the way in which prayer is something that exceeds us. And the reason I want to give this is not because we should always think about prayer this way. There are times where prayer is meaningful. There are times in which we pray, in which we feel our prayers mean something, that somebody's listening, that they can have an effect on the world. And that's very important. But we also have to acknowledge that what is prayer when all of that is taken away? And inevitably, we reach moments where all of that is taken away. And what do? Do we simply not pray? Right? There are a lot of Jews who say, you know what? I can't pray anymore. What's the point of this? I can go to shul and sing with everybody else. We can feel good as we say the words that I used to hear my grandparents say. I can have nostalgia. I can hear a great chazan. Is that prayer? No, right? Prayer is this element in which there's a part of us that exceeds ourselves in saying the words and reaching out, even if we don't even fully understand what it means, even if we think it's kind of silly, because that's what a Jew does. It's like he says here, it's inscribed on the body, right? Like a Jew just does this whether they like it or not. They're in the basement after Auschwitz and they're saying these prayers. And I read that text. I've taught the text many times from Rabbi Mital. And there's a part of me just like can't help trying to imagine what is going on in that room. Because whatever's going on in that cellar is a combination of probably the most powerful davening I've ever seen, and probably the most profoundly difficult davening I could ever imagine, right? In which it just seems like empty and meaningless in a sense too. And prayer has to be able to make a space for those experiences, at least prayer in the way that we encounter it today. With the time we have left, I want to just play off another angle here that Rav Shagar gets at. And what does it mean to pull that wooden sword out, knowing it's absurd, knowing it isn't what we think it is? And that's that we have to keep in mind, at least in the context of the story, that when the man pulls out his wooden sword, a miracle does happen. And the king is somehow happy with this. He sees it all kind of like as a joke. The man goes free, the criminal goes free. Everything seems to work out in the end, in a sense. And what we have to recognize here, as absurd as prayer is, sometimes it seems to work. Right? That's what actually kind of makes prayer even more impossible, is just when you think prayer is impossible, that's the moment when prayer works. Because that's what the man discovers, right? In the very moment where he's pulling out a wooden sword that's like a joke, that's actually the moment where the miracle happens, right? Which is very, very striking to us. Oftentimes we only encounter those things that we can't fully understand exactly at the moment we think we can understand everything, when there's no reason to even imagine that there's anything beyond our understanding, right? When we've given up, I mean, this is again a little bit trite, but it's often only when we give up hope that we can actually be open to the possibility that there is real hope in some sense, right? Like as long as we're holding on to certain realities or possibilities, it's fundamentally impossible for us to see what we can't imagine. And this is what Rav Shagar is getting at, in this idea that there's something miraculous that can happen when we pull out that wooden sword. He says at this point, this is sort of says here, comes the self-overcoming. Because again, there's something absurd about pulling the wooden sword out. It doesn't make sense. We don't want to do it. We don't think we should do it. So when we do it, there's something radical about that. When we pray, even though we know it's absurd, which is essentially a movement of renunciation. His wooden sword, the prayer that expresses his entire fake religious world, it becomes real. There's a moment where it actually does what it's supposed to do. To be precise, we're not talking here about a ritualized and sterilized religious existence like the behavioralist descriptions of the religious ritual. It's not like we're just doing this over and over again because we feel like that's what we're supposed to do, right? But rather one that, even though we don't think it's meaningful, but one that generates what it is supposed to generate. That is the prayer that is answered in it, right? There's a moment in which we do the impossible with prayer and the impossible happens, and we don't know what to make of that. And even though we might think this sounds ridiculous, what do you mean? The impossible happens, prayer, right? What's going on here? It's absurd, but the impossible happens. Well, this is, I think, what happens with Purim on a certain level. And Yishai helps us make this point, is that a large part about it being a religious Jew means recognizing that the impossible happens. And recognizing that the impossible happens exactly in a way that is often disturbing and bizarre and ridiculous to us. That there's often a deep, profound joke when the impossible happens, because it doesn't seem like this should ever happen. When the opposite of what you expect happens, it can be very scary or it can be very sad, but sometimes it's just so absurd that part of you just wants to laugh. And the more absurd it is, the more it maybe wants you, the louder that laugh is. So I want to describe here how Yishai describes the Purim story, the Megillah, in which, again, the impossible happens. And what I would argue is that prayer marks the place of the impossible, right? We pray even though it's absurd, because on some level, the absurd, the impossible does happen, even if we can't understand it. And prayer is what marks the space for that. So here's what Yishai says. He says, then came the sage's assertion that the scroll was written by the Holy Spirit, and therefore must be seen as part of the Holy Scriptures. He's noting here how one of the radical moves of Chazal was to say the Purim story, the Megillah, is a story where God is found. Because when you read the Megillah, God's name isn't in it. When you read the Megillah, you can read it as a purely secular story. There's no reason you have to read the Megillah as a religious story. It's not only do you have to not read it as a religious story, it's such like a modern secular story, right? It's a story of anti-Semitism. And how did the Jews overcome anti-Semitism in the Megillah? Well, you all probably gave money to your federation, or you probably sat in a federation speech before. What does the federation say, right? We got to raise money because we got to band together because we need solidarity so that we can go leverage our ability, our power to those in charge so that we can fight on behalf of the Jews, right? Like that's the story of Purim. That's the story of like modern Jewish life, right? Modern secular American Jewish life is one in which we have to have solidarity. We have to recognize anti-Semitism is real, and those Jews who have power have to use it on behalf of others. They have to advocate for the Jewish people on behalf of whatever power they got in order so that we can defend ourselves, right? It's a great modern secular story about what Jews can do when they don't have to worry about God, when they just take their responsibility, they take their destiny into their own hands. But that's not the way we read the story, right? We read the story as God being all over it in some way. So here's what he says. He says, the sages declare that wherever they wrote in the scroll, the Megillah, the king, Melech, it's not Achashverosh, but the Melech Malchei Hamlachim, the king of kings. Of course, there are those who see this declaration as an educational ideological act. That is a step designed to educate the hearts of the people that everything is in the hands of heaven. Meaning you could read the rabbis and say, all they want to do is put God back in the story, right? All the rabbis want to do is put God everywhere they can in the Megillah, right? Even where it doesn't really seem to belong, because you don't have to read the story that way. So you could argue that the whole interpretive move of trying to read God in the Megillah is an apology, is an apologetic as a way of turning what is clearly a secular text into a religious text. But Yishai is pointing out that would maybe missing something important. He says, but perhaps it can be understood that this declaration by Chazal, the gods in the Megillah, as well as the very inclusion of the book of Esther in the Holy Script in Tanakh, is nothing but a disturbance in terms of an I am prayer, right? Ani tefillah. There are moments where my body prays. There are moments where I feel like I'm going to do this, even though it's absurd and crazy. And the very act of seeing God within the Megillah falls into that kind of paradigm. So what does he mean by this? He says, like that call at the end of the game. He uses a sports metaphor here. I don't know if any sports fans. So one of the great things about being a sports fan is that you are inherently a religious person when you are a sports fan. Because when your team is down, and the game is on the line, or the championship is on the line, the season is on the line, and it comes down, again, to that one moment where I'm going to use the sports analogy from the most powerful, most recent version of this to me. So I am not a Cleveland sports fan, but I was a rabbi in Cleveland for a decade, and I got to watch the Cavs in 2016 as they made their big final run to win a championship, and it was a big deal in Cleveland because the city hadn't won a championship in decades. City that's been down on its luck. And somehow the Cavs went against one of the greatest teams in all of history, the Golden State Warriors, and pushed them to a game 7 after they'd already been down 3-1, right? It's just, how does this happen? They finally bring it to a game 7. Anything can happen in a game 7. And as it came down the line, it got closer and closer and closer. And there was this one moment in which Andre Iguodala is driving to the hoop to score for the Warriors in what would have clearly won the game. And there was like this instant where you just are looking and you think it's over. Like you think it's over. And there's part of you that's hoping for the impossible, but you really believe it's over. And then LeBron James came out of nowhere, literally, and blocked the shot, basically saving the game, saving the season, and winning them a championship. And the incredible thing about being a sports fan is that you beg, you hope, you pray for the impossible, but what really makes you religious as a sports fan is the impossible happens, right? There are moments in sports where the impossible happens at the last second. What you think is going to be one way turns out to be the complete opposite. And that's what Yishai is saying here, right? He says, like the call at the end of the game that appears lost into the last second. And then in that second and a half, the unbelievable transformation happens. And when that happens, there's a part of it that just says, there's a God. Right? Because that's what happens when there's a miracle, when reality defies itself, right? He says, isn't this reading a kind of interference with the self-evident reality? You think the world is one way, and then something happens and it forces you to look at it in a totally different way. The game was won not because of the hand of God, but because of the hand of a player who practiced a lot to score a basket. It's not a miracle. LeBron James is like the greatest basketball player who ever lived, probably the greatest basketball athlete who ever lived. If anybody was going to make that play, it was him. But that's not the way we experience it. He says, but on the other hand, the call, there's a God, is inscribed within reality. And what he means by this is when we see the impossible, there's a part of us that can't help but jump out and acknowledge the impossible. It is not the result of drawing a conclusion, but the activation of reality that there is God. Since it is not a conclusion, meaning it's not something we rationally come to. It's just there's a part of us that can't help but acknowledge the miracle, the impossible, when it occurs. On the contrary, it is her appeal that requires her. It is the appeal that requires it. Reality is experienced as a reality disrupted by faith in God, who wins the game and redeems Israel from its enemy. Right? You can look at the Megillah as if it's a secular story. You can look at the Cavs winning the championship as if it was just, the best player in the world doing what he does, or you can look at it in its impossibility. And what prayer does is it marks the space of that impossibility. That even though we do this thing that doesn't make sense, we don't know who's listening, we think we know it doesn't really work the way that we want it to, but even nonetheless, sometimes those prayers are answered in ways that we can't fully understand. And by prayer marking a place of the impossible, it keeps open a profound space for religious life that we all need. Because without that way in which the impossible can happen, then why are we praying at all? We're praying to make ourselves feel good. We're praying because we hope God hears us. Right? It's the fact that prayer might actually do something that actually makes prayer at the end of the day. I see that we're just about out of time. So I'll look to pause here. And I just want to emphasize too, the looking at prayer in the way that we have. There are many ways to look at prayer. I'm not saying this is the only way you have to look at prayer, the way you should look at prayer. But what Rav Shagar is trying to grapple with is the recognition that prayer is at times impossible. And when we recognize prayer is impossible, like, what do we do? Should we even still go to shul? And Rav Shagar's argument would be, well, you go to shul, not because it makes sense, but because that's like where your feet are going to take you. And you open up the siddur, not because you like the words, but because there's a part of you that just feels those are the words that have to be said. Prayer shouldn't always feel like that, but there are moments where it feels impossible. Like I said, we pull out our sword knowing it's wood and we just do it anyway, because that's what we do. That's what a Jew does. And the other aspect of prayer that I think is very important is recognizing that as absurd as it is and as impossible as it is, sometimes the prayers get answered, even if we can't understand why or how. And in the impossibility of our prayers being answered, prayer marks that space for that which exceeds sort of the rules in which we think the world is supposed to work. And we need moments for when those rules fall apart, because that's what a religious orientation necessitates at times, and prayer helps us mark the space. A lot of times we'll prayer and it doesn't make sense and the impossible won't happen. But at least if we pray and the impossible does actually happen, that's a totally different kind of experience for us. But it's the very experience of being a religious Jew at the end of the day. And we have to hold ourselves open for that possibility. So let me stop here, and if there's any questions, I have a minute or two. But I'll leave it with that.
Any question, anyone, before we close today's class? Let me double check and see if we have any questions on Facebook. Doesn't look like it. Okay, so thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, and thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Just to remind you that on Sunday, March 19th, we'll have the Rappaport Family Memorial Lecture. It will be at noon Eastern, and the topic will be related to the Passover Seder. You can find out more information about that and also about other classes at drisha.org. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.